Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last Strand group of the season, because we always think in academic years, you know. This is the 63rd Strand group, or 172 for those who know. So the Strand group now, as of July, I think, is in its 10th year, and the precursor, the Mile End group, in its 20th year. And actually, I was doing the maths on this earlier. I think it's the 30th year of government partnership that started off in a small way back in 1993. So this is something we've been doing for a very long time. But I must say that I think it's gathering pace and power. And tonight's event, I'm particularly pleased about. My name's John Davis. I'm director of the Strand Group. And we are here this evening to mark the inaugural lecture as visiting professor of Sarah Munby, the new permanent secretary of the new Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. The way this evening is going to work is that I'm going to invite Professor Marion Thane to say a few words first. Then we'll hand over to Sarah, who's going to give us the talk. We are then going to have a question and answer session. We're going to have a vote of thanks. This is important to Kings, so bear with us for the formalities this evening. So without further ado, before having Sarah talk on realising the potential of DSIT and its leadership of science and technology policy across the UK government, good title, I'd like to invite the Executive Dean, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Professor Marion Thane, Professor of Culture and Technology, to open the proceedings. Thank you, Marion.
Thanks, John. Real pleasure to be here tonight. And I want to start by reminding us all of something that's happened very recently, which is a group of global tech leaders calling for a pause in the development of AI. Why are they calling for that pause in the development of AI? Not because we don't have the technical skills, not because we can't code well enough, but because we don't have the frameworks in place to ensure that that technology is going to be developed to the best effect in relation to the social and individual good. So the Digital Futures Institute at King's was designed precisely to pick up that piece of work. It was launched just a few months ago, but we've already got a lot of momentum. And what we're doing in the Digital Futures Institute at King's is reframing what have previously been seen as technical problems that require technical fixes or solutions as social and individual problems that require much broader ways of knowing, of responding, and of working. So that's a little bit about the Digital Futures Institute. At King's, we have particular expertise across all disciplines in this field, and we have particular potential to address some of these challenges that are at heart not disciplinary based. And our little mission tagline for the Digital Futures Institute is living well with technology. And what we're looking to do is to try and harness the opportunities of this age while addressing some of the problems and minimizing some of those potential risks. So I guess I would say there are three distinctive elements to what we're doing at the Digital Futures Institute. One is to get away from the yay or nay technology binary. We don't all have to be forced into being tech optimists or nay-saying hand-wringers. I think this is an incredibly damaging binary that has encompassed a lot of the debate recently. We need to find a middle way through, where, as I say, we can recognize the opportunities, but also recognize and address the risks. The second really distinctive thing about what we're doing at King's in the Digital Futures Institute is this very broad multidisciplinary approach. We recognize that the social sciences, the humanities, all of these disciplines bring something really essential to the debate about technology and need to be integrated with our STEM colleagues in crafting our digital futures. And the third distinctive thing is we're thinking about the relationship between the individual and technology across a broad time span. We think that knowing our history is incredibly important to be able to look forward and to be able to think about where we should be going with this technology. So the Digital Futures Institute currently contains 4 centres: Centre for Digital Law, Centre for Technology in the Body, Centre for Attention Studies, and Centre for Digital Cultures. But we are looking to add a Centre for Digital Policy. And we're hoping that the Institute will become the absolutely nation-leading space to have these kinds of events. So it's absolutely amazing to have Sarah with us tonight. Really, really looking forward to this lecture. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, and really good to hear about all of that, I must say. DSIT isn't 6 months old yet, so I think we're still allowed to think of ourselves as kind of a relatively new creature, and therefore you have to give us all the dispensations that you give to new creatures. I certainly don't have all of the answers to this rather long question, but what I am going to try to do today is give some suggestions as to where we need to go. The department, for those of you who don't know us well, was created from the part of BAYS, the department I used to run, that looked after science and innovation policy, and the part of DCMS that looked after digital and technology policy, alongside some of the critical science and tech strategy functions from the Cabinet Office. So for the first time, really bringing together science, innovation, digital, and technology into one part of government. And as you can imagine, we're already seeing lots of opportunities to capitalise on those connections, to accelerate work that's already happening, to reinforce capabilities that were strong in the predecessor departments. But what I want to talk about today is where are the places where we might be able to drive more of a step change, where we can do something a little bit different that was harder to do before. But before I start going into solutions, and I should warn you now, by the way, that they aren't policy solutions. If you want the policy solutions, you're going to have to invite a politician. But I am going to give you some thoughts on how we work, how we make sure we stay ahead in policy, and the kind of capabilities and structures that let us do that. But before I do that, I think in policy making, we always need to start by thinking about French generals in the 20s and 30s, arraying their strategic lines of defense ready for trench warfare, and forgetting that tanks were coming across the horizon. And there's an endless possibility in this policy area, more than almost any other, of preparing for the last war. So before we start thinking about what it is we need to be, who we're trying to be when we grow up, what characteristics, structures, and capabilities the department needs, I thought it was worth sharing some reflections on what the next science, innovation, and technology revolution might look like and what that might mean for government. And I should say that it would be a mistake to make very specific predictions today. I think if we've learned anything from the last few months, it's that. But I do think there are some themes that we need to be prepared for. Exactly how they manifest is uncertain, but as policymakers, we need to have them top of the list. And these are things where I think we're going to see a different flavour of change and of development to the flavour that we have seen over the last 10, 20 years. And the first of those themes is pace. And you might say, well, that's an ironic thing to choose, Sarah, because you're saying it's different. But Sarah Healy, who was the permanent secretary at DCMS, was here just 9 months ago talking about pace as one of the critical challenges in digital policy. And I guess what I wanted to say is, well, she was definitely right, wasn't she? Because as we just heard, since that time, there's been an explosion of interest in artificial intelligence from every corner of the nation, whether that's the media, whether that's enterprise, whether that's government. And it's not just here, it's internationally. And that, of course, has been reflected in a much greater level of pace and resourcing in government as well. We're organising an international summit on AI for later this year. That's a pretty demanding timescale. But we're not the only people who are trying to do things quickly. I think every boardroom in this country and around the world is grappling with the challenges and opportunities of generative AI specifically, and in fact, AI more broadly. Anyone who hadn't kind of got that memo beforehand definitely got it now. it's unusual to have widespread speculation about the end of the world. And it's not something that government can afford to be slow or not responsive on. It's everything, everywhere, all at once on AI right now. And that is quite challenging for public administration, right? Doing a lot of work right across the system, understanding a really fast-moving stakeholder picture, developing the domestic and international regulatory response, thinking about applying AI in the public sector and the opportunities to improve public services. This is a really serious program of work, and trying to do that quickly across such a wide range of areas really puts pace in kind of sharp focus. So I think what Sarah said about pace was exactly right, but maybe not even strong enough. The question then becomes, it's always very tempting, right, to believe that the next set of technological changes are always faster than the previous set. And I'm in danger of sort of stepping on the hype accelerator myself here. But the question is, are we going to be surprised like this lots more times? Are we going to have the same kind of need to mobilize much more of the muscles of public administration at pace to deal with an emerging issue both domestically and internationally? And while I'm not sure I know what the thing is that's going to trigger that requirement, I'm pretty confident we're going to see this movie again. And if nothing else, that's simply because the technology changes that we're seeing now, particularly in AI, are themselves accelerators of other technological changes. So I think we can expect this to happen again. And therefore, when I talk about the kind of step change that we need to make in capability, in structures, in how we work, themes that help us deal with pace, themes like agility and expertise are absolutely central, in my mind, to what we need to do in order to capture the opportunity ahead. But the second theme I wanted to touch on builds on this, because I talked about technologies enabling technological development. And you might have seen that one of the things that we did quite early on in the development of the department was we put out a set of priority technologies for the UK, areas where the UK is really going to focus all sorts of different kinds of investment to make sure that we can capture advantage. AI, semiconductors, quantum, future telecoms, and engineering biology. Now, the truth is you could pick others, right? But the thing that strikes me now, for the first time in government, looking after a department that has all of these technologies under one roof, is not so much the debate about kind of one in, one out. Would you like to add or subtract any particular technology from this list? Everyone will have their favorites. It's actually the convergence and integration of these technologies and what that means for public policy. So if we take engineering biology just as one of those five, it sort of on the face of it might feel it's actually the one that's least related to the other four, which all feel kind of squarely in the digital economy space. But if we think about the future of engineering biology, it's going to be defined by, of course, artificial intelligence-driven models that help us define and sequence the right DNA. It's increasingly defined by semiconductors, miniaturized technology for actually bespoke manufacturing DNA. Once you've done your engineering biology and you're trying to work out what's happened and see inside the organism that you've created, quantum sensors are going to be critical. So I won't pretend that I will ever be the technical authority on those interlinkages, but the fact that those interlinkages exist is really, really important for government policy, because it means that we don't have 5 or 7 or 10 or 15 for any future government priority technologies. We have an interlocking, complex and converging set of technology priorities that need to be dealt with in a way that is integrated and strategic. And I'll come back to the importance of integration and strategy later. The third theme I wanted to alight on is very DSIT, for want of a better framing. And this is looking at the growth in startups and business investment that really rely on scientific and technical breakthroughs. So the amount of VC investment going into those kind of firms has increased 33 times over the last 10 years. And if you kind of look at the data year upon year, those companies that are founded from true scientific and technical breakthroughs are becoming a bigger and a bigger part of the landscape. Now, why does that matter for government policy? Is that just an interesting fact? Well, these kind of startups are much more likely to have been spun out from universities. They're much more likely to employ technical talent, people with PhDs. They're much more likely to have intellectual property as part of the assets of the company. They're also much more likely, by the way, to have received government grant support because government is such a significant player in the early stage innovation environment. That's true in this country and internationally. So if we think that is going to be an even more important part of the technology policy landscape, then those science policy levers and the ability to pull through from science policy into technology policy and deployment is going to become an even bigger part of our problem. And if ever there was a good argument for bringing together science and technology into one department, I think that's it. So pull through, making the whole system work together throughout the funnel has got to be part of the future direction for government. The fourth theme I wanted to touch on, opinions could differ on. And I do appreciate that you're still waiting for your jetpack and your flying car. But I wanted to talk about hardware. I don't think it makes sense in government terms, or indeed in any other terms, to think about digital as something isolated from into the virtual world. It's not up there on the internet, which we were at risk of kind of starting to define as a paradigm. It's out there. It's the drones that are already becoming a mainstream part of my children's lives, even if not yet part of my adult day-to-day experience. It's in the checkout-less shop that doesn't even have an automated checkout, let alone a human checkout yet. It's in the completely widespread and normal adoption of robotic manufacture. But those hardware, physical issues are going to be a really, really critical part of the technology landscape that the department is facing into. It can't be digital as virtual, it's digital as physical as well. Whether that's going to be space-based manufacture or space-based energy generation, whether it's going to be advanced sensors to manage water pollution, whether it's going to be smart grid technologies, or to use an example that everyone has top of their heads, autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles is worth a double click because it's a really good example of why it's hard from a governmental point of view to make technological change work effectively. Because to get autonomous vehicles working on the road, it's definitely something we worry about, right? You can imagine there's lots of R&D work that goes into that kind of operation. It's definitely something that the business department worries about when it's thinking about car manufacture, trade deals, those sorts of issues. It's something the Department for Transport worries about. It's got all sorts of implications for roads and how they work. It's something that local authorities need to worry about. It's also got a load of human and ethical and communications issues that sit alongside it. So the number of different parts of government that need to work together just to make one thing work effectively is incredibly striking. It's true of lots of innovation that's purely digital, but as you come into physical deployment of these technologies, you just sort of multiply interested groups. You're adding the police, you're adding the fire service. Before you've even begun, the list is almost the whole of government. So this point about leadership of science and technology across government is really, really vital. If the UK is going to win in this arena, we have to be able to coordinate and bring together. The last theme, then, is the one that is perhaps most obvious. It's the impact of these technologies. Now, it's beyond cliched to say that science and technology is going to have a critical impact on the biggest problems that society faces, health, climate, etc. But the insight from a governmental point of view is that these are also the biggest problems government faces. Our policy people across government, that is what they're spending their time on, right? These really big, challenging issues. And science and technology is going to be critical to them. And that means that in almost all of the policy muscle right across the system, you need science and technology thinking to be integral. Because if you don't put science and technology at the heart of all of those policy development areas, you're going to be missing a trick. So it further reinforces this point about you may have a department for science and technology, but what you're trying to get that department to do is create a government for science and technology in which science and technology are infused into everything that the government does. So you can sort of take or leave those 5 themes. You might kind of think, maybe 4 of them are right. But if I try to add them up into a set of implications, it says to me that to realise the potential of having a department that sits at this converging landscape of science and technology policy and tries to use that converging landscape to drive change, not just through its own levers, but through the levers right across the government system and indeed the public sector more broadly. What would you want that to be like? Well, you'd want it to be, I think, more strategic, able to bring together these difficult choices and trade-offs. You'd want it to be more integrated, able to bring together those different stakeholders and drive change on autonomous vehicles or indeed anything else. And you'd want it to be more agile and expert and able to manage these huge changes in pace and unexpected developments as they arise. So those are all quite difficult words, I think, for government. Being truly strategic, integrated, agile, expert, that's a tough prescription. So I thought I would just try to make some suggestions about where some kind of points of focus might be that would take us some way along that journey. I don't sort of pretend that this recipe cooks the entire cake, but I hope it would move us in the right direction. So the first of my 5 suggestions is really about the practical underpinnings of cross-government work. And I hope you'll sort of allow me to go into just a little bit of kind of Whitehall and policy nerdery for a minute here, because I think it's a really important point. It's of course true to say that almost all the problems of modern government are not owned by a single department. Climate, that I used to spend a lot of my time on, is a really fantastic example of something where you need people right across government to be working in a coordinated way, but it's not the only problem like that. Levelling up, hugely cross-cutting issue. Skills policy is incredibly cross-cutting. The list goes on. And so we do know some things about how to do that work well. And it's not rocket science, actually. A clear shared plan, tasks, owners, milestones, deliverables, maybe even metrics. These help us coordinate activity across the complexity of government, just as they help private sector organisations coordinate their activity across the complex parts of their business. And since the creation of DSIT, we've already started taking some really important steps in that direction, in not the machinery of government as jargon for changing the organisation of departments, but the literal machinery of government, the bits and the parts that move to make things happen. The Science and Technology Framework, which lays out the 10 areas for action for the UK to become a science and technology superpower, is a vital first step on that journey. There's more to do. We're making sure that each of those 10 areas has a clear owner and a clear delivery plan that sits underneath it, for example. And by the way, that is not easy, because even within one of those pillars, you have multiple departments and multiple interests involved. Something like skills, critical for the agenda that we're talking about, is not purely a one-department effort. It's not just about education. It's about access to international skills. It's about where the best talent in the world is and how we go after it. We're not going to build it all at home. So across the 10 and within each one, we need to be able to coordinate across government. Having a dedicated cabinet committee for science and technology, again, definitely falls into sort of the nerdery category, but pretty important for making decisions and managing delivery. I think, though, that we've got a lot more to do here. And in the case of science and technology specifically, we sometimes talk about the pillars of the science and technology framework, and we're sort of calling to mind the strategy visual that all of you will have seen, where you have your pillars, and they support a roof. And the roof is, becoming a science and technology superpower, and the pillars are your regulation and skills and infrastructure and R&D. And I think that is fundamentally the wrong mental model. This isn't a colonnade that we're dealing with, where if one of the pillars is a bit weak, the roof still stands. This is much more like a bridge or an arch, where we're reliant on each of the stones working together, and one weak stone is a serious problem. And that's particularly true because of what I said about pull-through and moving innovation from the lab through to the business's hands or the consumer's hands who are going to use it in the end. You can't afford any step in that process to fall down. And we know that at the moment our performance is too mixed through that funnel. So how do we make sure that we're really focused on the whole arch, on identifying and addressing the weak spots? If that's the first thing, then, this just continuing to focus on the practical underpinnings of what it looks like to work across government, I'd dive even deeper into one particular area of that for the second thought, which is we need to work particularly hard on the join-up between economic and security policy, or to put it in a related but not quite the same way, the join-up between managing opportunity and managing risk. That's obviously important for the sorts of things that we're talking about. Quantum technology, which I mentioned as one of the 5 priority technologies, and its impacts on encryption is a kind of straightforward example. The discussion that's going on about AI right now is all about that. How do we handle both opportunity and risk at the same time? But if you look into the system of government, you've got a fantastically capable and well-equipped security community that has its own ways of doing things, and you don't always have good linkage between that community and the community of economic and social policymakers. It's very similar to what you were just discussing in the context of academia, where you need to bring together different disciplines. This is exactly an example of that kind of bridging. And we know we can do it well. I think the National Cybersecurity Centre is a good example where we're able to bring together the kind of technical expertise and the security understanding of colleagues from the agencies on the one hand, with the open attitude and business connections of much of the rest of the system. But we need to do a lot more of that. And it's going to become an ever bigger part of our journey as these technologies grow. And if we don't do that brilliantly, we risk losing one of the most important games in all of this, which is public trust and keeping the public with us. So I think I'd go even further and say that that economic security join-up is also then a join-up into the world of trust, ethics, public understanding, and communication. So the third one that I think needs real attention is about expertise. But it's a commonplace to say that government needs more expertise. And I think there are many bits of this expertise problem that are really well acknowledged and where plans exist and are being implemented to make things better. So the general lack of scientific, engineering and technical expertise in government, for example. Sort of the collective civil service and politician class have talked about that at length, and the intent to try to make sure that, for example, half of our fast stream entrants come from STEM backgrounds. I do think we will fix that. It's not easy, and it's going to need a lot of vigilance. But the bit that I worry about in particular is deep expertise, particularly in these areas of fast-moving technology, where much of the wisdom sits in the commercial world. Because that is a really tough kind of expertise to bring into government. It is not as simple as targeting a different group of recruits. It's not even as simple as addressing public sector pay and offering more of a financial reward. Because in these kind of fields, you don't have a large stock of people who are coming to the end of their career, because there hasn't been time for people to come to the end of their career yet. And by the way, that is a place where governments around the world successfully fish for wisdom and expertise to bring into the public sector. That doesn't work as well in these fast-moving areas. You're dealing with people who have very high financial rewards on the table, but in the future, not now. So even if you address some of the salary gap, you can't come close to addressing the kind of broader future compensation gap. And you need to be able to act really fast because these are very small and highly competitive talent pools. Now, we have some success in this area. It's certainly not a hopeless case. The work we've just been doing over the last few months on the Foundation Model Task Force, designed to bring more AI expertise into government, I think is progressing really well. We've been in the market for a national technology advisor exactly to help fill this gap kind of at the top table in the department. Our secondments program, where we're bringing people in from the outside for shorter periods, is progressing really well. We need to do all of these things and more and make technical talent in government, first of all, sort of first step, make it as much of a priority as scientific talent in government, and then take both of them on to even higher ambition. The fourth thought harks back to what I said about pace and its implication for how quickly we need to act. And this is about making agility more mainstream in the way that we work. And I think it's really, really important to say that we absolutely have a proven track record in operating at really impressive pace. Many of the activities of government during COVID are fantastic examples of being able to see a problem and react to it swiftly. The Vaccines Task Force is a really visible example of that from Bays, where I used to be. We're doing the same thing now, again, on the Foundation Model Task Force, seeing an area where we need to act fast, deploying the right people, the right experts, and seeking to move rapidly to action and output. But it's hard to imagine a world in which there would be sort of where that becomes a scalable enough model to work on all of the things that we need to do quickly. We need to be able to take some of the strengths of that kind of thinking, establishing multifunctional teams, empowered owners of particular missions and tasks, the ability to act iteratively, and just plug them through the entire operating culture of not just this department, but lots of other parts of government that work on these issues. And I have confidence, absolutely, that we can do this in parts of the system. I talked about the VTF and the Foundation Model Task Force, but ARIA is another brilliant example of kind of doing this at scale. But these are all, they're all examples kind of at the edge versus examples that are about scaling right across the system. And I think we need to think through the toolbox for doing this kind of in lots of places all at once. I don't have the answer, but it could include how we use tools like our risk appetite, how we change our delegation structures, how we move to more flexible resourcing models and what that means for individuals' careers. How do we take the concept of sandboxes that we've used so successfully in, as it were, policy innovation and start using sandboxes in the way that we make policy and innovating in that? I think there's a rich pool of things to explore there, but the potential impact is profound. Now, the last thought is close to being an outright contradiction to that. Ironically, at the same time as I'm asking us to look into ways of being more agile, it will not surprise you to say that at the exact same time, I'm asking us to be more stable and more consistent. And we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. It cannot be one or the other. The points about the scale of the impact available here on the biggest problems facing not only this country but humanity, the points about the cycle times involved in hardware and not just software, the need to gather work from across a really complex government system that makes up a really significant fraction of the economy, right? This is a really complex problem. Patience is going to be part of the answer here. And that is not always easy in government. The ability to make really scaled bets on the things that we think are going to be important and then pursue them year after year after year. That is not a new challenge for policymaking, comes up in all sorts of different contexts, but I think it's really critical to keep reminding us that it is equally important here. I think some good old-fashioned discipline around that will serve us really well as we look out into this fast-moving landscape. So I think patience is probably where I'll end, because this journey to realizing the potential of the institution that we have created, to becoming that more strategic, more integrated, more expert and more agile organization and indeed government, is not a quick one. It's certainly not going to happen overnight. And I will say, I think we're going to need both challenge and support through that journey. So I'm really glad to be here tonight with this group and looking forward to hearing your thoughts, suggestions, and feedback. I'm delighted that King's is investing in this area of policy making as something to think more about, because I think we're going to need all the ideas we can get as we seek to really fulfill our promise. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and thank you also to our sponsors, Workday and Amazon Web Services, for making this happen. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm, I think, looking forward to a round of questions.
Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for questions. First one's going to come from me, really, which is that phrase, picking winners. You know, it's got a lot of connotations for younger members of the audience. This became cliche in the 60s and 1970s and became something that was, you know, it was an insult, really, of how government couldn't do these things. But it seems very clear to us all that this is something that is now forced upon us, that as a country, every country has got to be able to pick winners. How do we do it when it went so wrong last time?
A great question. So, I mean, maybe the first thing I'd say is a very basic distinction, but I think we have to distinguish between picking winners at the firm level and picking areas of investment / winners at the industry level. And I do think the industry is a safer territory to operate in than the firm level. That doesn't mean it's completely safe or without risk from a government point of view, because the risk of attempting to prop something up in the face of trends that are kind of operating against you, especially, by the way, if you don't have the expertise, you don't have the understanding, so you're not building from the right fact base, is really high. And it's, by the way, pretty arrogant to think that you do have the fact base. We should know that, right? Like, there's a huge number of people, far more highly paid than me, who spend their time kind of predicting where the money flow is going to be, where the opportunities are, and we should always be very humble about that in government, I think. But, as you said, we don't have a choice, because a complete lack of strategy is a strategy. So if we're not prepared to make choices about where we do intervene, using the levers that we are definitely going to have. So, I mean, a really good example is R&D expenditure, right? Which we know has enormous value and is an intelligent place for government to operate, because especially at the earlier stages of the funnel, it has all the sort of fundamental characteristics of a public good. And there's a very good argument for government involvement and government intervention. Well, if you're going to do R&D spend, you will find that that R&D spend is going more into some areas than others. And you have to ask yourself whether you're becoming an accidental strategist and making choices without realizing. I also think the second thing that kind of layers into that problem comes back to what I was saying about security and the way that we're operating in the true sense a strategic environment, by which I mean we've got multiple actors around the world pursuing different courses. And if strategy is kind of a concept that comes from warfare, strategy as applied to industrial choices and technology choices is definitely here and in play in the global economy today. So again, choosing not to have a strategy is choosing to opt out. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to experience the sort of downsides. One of the challenges in all of this is how you make sure that government has, if not the risk appetite, at least the risk tolerance to manage a portfolio of investments, some of which will fail, which is an easy concept, or an easier concept if you're in a PLC, and quite a hard concept if you're in SW1.
Thank you. Okay, so many questions. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Can I have name and affiliation, please? And I'm just going to gradually do it this way. First here, please. Yep.
Hi there. I'm Benjamin Reid, and I'm the Director of Innovation for the Confederation of British Industry. Our members have been huge supporters, particularly ones that are focused on R&D and innovation, of the creation of science, innovation, and technology. But of course, what it does do is separate out a Department for Business from the Department for Science and Technology. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about, particularly obviously as business is the main investor in R&D and technology and innovation, about how the department is engaging business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important, and I think I can say this with confidence, having previously run BAYS, which was the previous Department for Business. I think it's really important to remember that the Department for Business, wherever it sits in the government structure, isn't the only Department for Business. And actually engaging business and working with investors, working with people who understand what's happening on the ground is critical for a whole range of government departments, and arguably critical for every government department, including those who don't commonly see themselves as departments for business. But that's probably a separate conversation for another day. For us, I think it's about two things. One is there are just, as a sort of very practical matter of practice, a whole series of sectors for which we have the government lead. In the same way that the Department for Transport has the lead for some sectors, we've got the lead for a whole range of particularly innovative sectors, including life sciences, space, the digital economy in general. So kind of plenty of businesses who are just ours to look after and go after. But to make a banal but important comment, the second one is that the technologies that we're talking about here aren't sectoral and are completely cross-cutting and apply to every business in the country. So business organizations, investors, innovators of all kinds are absolutely critical stakeholders for us.
Please. Yep.
Nicholas Beale from SciTech. Thank you very much. I must say it's incredibly encouraging to have people like you with your background, not 100% of the civil service in this kind of area. I mean, it's great to have career civil servants as well, but it's slightly damaging if everyone's a career civil servant. My question, Sarah, is you rightly point out that almost everything important is cross-cutting across a large number of departments. And the only way that's ever been made to work is by having somebody really senior and empowered to make a load of decisions. We now have a situation where there are approximately 200-something permanent secretaries per department, as far as I can make out. Everybody has at least one second permanent secretary. The Treasury has sort of between 3 and 4, depending on how you look at it. Do you think there could be any possibility that each of the second permanent secretaries, in addition to their important role as being second permanent secretary of their department, could be given responsibility for some kind of cross-cutting mission? Because all you permanent secretaries form a very efficient network, cabal, or whatever. And these are people who know how to get things done in government. And maybe if people at permanent secretary level, half of them were trying to get cross-disciplinary things done, it might have a slightly better chance of happening. Question.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought. I thought you were going to say that you were worried about kind of the dilution of decision-making power at the top of the department, and I was going to say in jest that you massively overstate the ability of permanent secretaries to take decisions. But I think that probably that not in quite the way you've described, but the concept of really senior people in one department, and why shouldn't they be second permanent secretaries, taking responsibility for implementing an agenda across government is absolutely one that is happening now. Be that a DG in the energy department who's responsible for net zero across government, or a DG in the department for levelling up, responsible for levelling up across government. I think it's a perfectly sensible thought to think about how we can make sure that we leverage our most senior leaders. And by the way, I don't think this is really a problem that's unique to government, right? That difficulty of how do you balance, in any leadership role, how do you balance the time that's sort of spent looking into your own organisation versus across and out to the other organisations around you. And the very complexity of doing that really well, I think, is probably one of the reasons why actually you're seeing investment at the kind of top tier of the civil service.
Robert Pratt from the Science Museum. As a historian, I think it's obvious that the areas behind upstream, and you yourself mentioned, are in the susceptible to government intervention. There's no great public objection to the public supporting that. However, downstream, at company level, governments have traditionally been very nervous about intervening. And then we hear stories about how the British are great discoverers and bad innovators. They're bad at implementing their own discoveries. How do you manage or solve the problem of the political differences between what you're doing and the management of business?
Well, I don't think the difference that you're talking about, the sort of the clear case for intervening at the start of the funnel, for want of a better phrase, versus the challenges of building the case for intervening at the end of the funnel. I don't think that's a purely political issue. I think it's also it's an issue in it's part of the underlying intellectual framework. We have very good public policy reasons for intervening there, and the public policy reasons for intervening here are often kind of harder to harder to bring together. I guess the thing that I would say is there's a difference between public expenditure and public intervention, and it's very easy, particularly when you're talking to the Treasury, to sort of fall into the trap and by the way, the private sector does this when talking to government, and people inside government do it when talking to other bits of government, into thinking that like the most important levers are levers of expenditure, where those sort of cases for why are we putting public money in are really, really critical. And we should be really cautious about putting public money in to places where we don't have a really strong justification. But policy more broadly, including our regulatory framework, the way that we handle our skills investment, the way that we operate internationally, our trade posture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all activities that operate on the business end, as it were, in both senses of that phrase, on the people who are really using and deploying the technology at scale, and on those who are running businesses. So I think, although the kind of the dichotomy probably does exist a bit on money, it really shouldn't exist in focus. And if you were, as you rightly say, if you were sort of grading the UK along the funnel, our strengths are too concentrated at the beginning. We should celebrate that, but build on it, get the pull through that I was talking about into deployment.
Please. Jen.
So I'm Jenny Holmes from NatWest. I'm from the People and Transformation team, and we face very similar issues with future skills for our people. So I'm just really interested in like how you are thinking that like you're going to legislate and help drive future skills, because obviously it's not something that just impacts government, but it's going to impact a number of industries across the UK. And how we don't just build apprenticeships, you mentioned young people, but I would challenge you about people returning to work, older people who need to build that future skill set that's going to enable them to thrive for the next 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the kind of the skills inside government, although, you know, as you can imagine, sort of acute interest to me in my role right now, are an absolutely tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a much bigger skills challenge, which is, you know, in a very sort of boring process way, that is one of the 10 pillars of the science and technology framework. It is one of the things we absolutely have to get right if we are going to build that, that arch that I was talking about. I think the question of kind of the direction of future skills policy for the UK is probably taking me into territory where I don't belong. But what I will say is the point that you made about retraining and adult skills, it is just a natural bedfellow with everything that I talked about in terms of the pace of change, agility, not just at a government level, but at an economy level, and how we're going to move fast enough. And it's something, therefore, that both DSIT and our predecessor departments have spent a lot of time engaging with DFE on, because it's not a subtle conclusion of what we've just been talking about. It's a really important and inevitable one.
Right at the back, please.
Thank you. Dan Hooper from Rolls-Royce. We see in some countries or governments across the world becoming a bit more statist in their appetite for public policy. But when it comes to international collaboration and research, I promise this isn't a question on the horizon.
I did wonder where it was going.
Towards more stateside, actually, on something, especially in areas like space technology. Do you see that there is an appetite for that international collaboration on research in those areas, particularly that DSIT have a bit more of a hand on, and the ability of the UK to play in that space?
I mean, yes, international collaboration is going to be critical, not just in the research space that you're talking about, but in kind of every phase of the funnel that we're talking about for the priority technologies, or indeed lots of other technologies too. But it's, I guess all I would say is, R&D partnerships are only one of the levers that we need to work with our partners on globally in order to kind of make that whole journey successful. So yes, and the work that we need to do together on regulation, skills is also an international agenda, making sure that we have a joined-up approach to the security issues that I talked about as being part of the picture. So yes, and more international collaboration, more international skills are going to be a critical part of the picture. And I very nearly, when I was talking about that need to kind of particularly focus on the economic security element of cross-government working, I think you could have made an equally strong case for saying that domestic, international interface in policy making is going to be a critical place for us to invest.
Please.
Yes, hi, I'm Thijs Broek, I'm Vice Chair of Policy at the City of London Corporation. I have two questions. One is about the here and now, and one is about the future, which you talked about a lot. And about the here and now, you said we risk preparing for the last war, but this taking us back to the current war and some wars that might be on the horizon that we all hope won't happen. But it's about national security. You touched upon it around economic and security. However, if you are looking at very nerdy, I'm going to be nerdy too, topics like, say, the new procurement bill that the government has just passed through Parliament, and what public sector is actually purchasing in tech products. They don't ask about security, they don't ask about cybersecurity, they don't ask about data sharing. They look at, most of the time, at the price, or they ask about you as an organization, you deliver these products, how cybersecure are you? And you see certain products are now being questioned from certain countries. So the question is there, really in the here and now, are we doing enough to think about that cybersecurity, about the data sharing, about our national security in that context with policy? And then one about the future, which you really eloquently put down. The challenge you have as a civil servant is politicians, and they often look not at that far away, because you're talking 10, 20, 30 years. This current government has 12 months left. The next government will think about their new term. So how do you make sure that, whilst understanding, of course, politicians are elected and they set the policy, how can you make sure that government as a whole looks at those longer term projects rather than just focusing on the electoral game here and now?
Yeah, two really good questions. So on the first question about are we doing enough on security in its broadest sense, I'm not sure I'm going to comment on that directly, but what I will say is what you said about procurement as a particular lever in this arena, not just because of security concerns or issues, but actually much more broadly, public sector procurement being an enabler of science and technology growth in the UK. I think there is definitively more to go after there. Procurement's another good example of a bit of government that I don't think anyone would ever expect DSIT to be in charge of, and I certainly I'm not pushing for that, but we need to be able to influence and drive it to make sure that procurement is kind of playing its role in the overall arch. On the question about how do you make long-term work happen in government, well, I mean, there's lots of people in this room who've spent a lot of time thinking about government and how you make it work effectively, and we'll have probably kind of rich experiences on this, because I don't think it's a science and technology specific issue. But two thoughts. The first is, I think actually having a department where a higher proportion of its work has a longer term horizon is a healthy thing. Because the reality is, if you operate in a department that has a lot of near-term crisis management or really highly day-to-day political activity, those things are a suck of people, energy. And by the way, they should be. That's not a criticism. They are rightly a suck of people, energy, ministerial, senior official attention. And I think actually, while we have things like that, it's just a smaller proportion of our kind of departmental business. So we've got a bit more capacity that naturally lends itself to long-term thinking. So I do think structure can help. And the other thing I would say is that although politics has a lot of short-termism in it, it is absolutely possible to get long-term work done. And lots of people of any party go into politics because they want to have a really beneficial impact on the country. And I don't sort of accept the premise that it's not possible to drive really long-term change in government. I do think that we all have to get really good at explaining to the population of the country today why the things that we are doing matter, because they are the kind of ultimate stakeholder beyond the politicians. And you can't sort of put it all on the never, never. And, you know, eventually it's going to deliver a lot of benefit to you down the line. You need to be able to articulate it in a way that people and voters can understand why the work that you do matters. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that.
Institutionally and in process terms has worked or not worked to try to address some of the issues that you raised. And secondly, as I'm from the MOD, I wonder if you could say a little bit about DSIT's relationship with the Ministry of Defence as a major sponsor of science and technology and the owner of DSTL and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take the second one first, if I may. So observation that will be obvious to you, but perhaps less obvious to everyone else. The MOD is one of the largest spenders of R&D in government. And I think one of the just very practical areas of leadership that we've kind of already started trying to grasp and grapple with is making sure that government has a better and stronger understanding of its R&D spend picture right across the piece, and does a better job of joining up R&D spend that's coming from different sources, but fundamentally addressing the same problem. And I think that's an example, I'm not saying that's kind of the only interaction between DSIT and the MOD, but that's a really practical example of where we need to make sure that if we're all interested in progressing the R&D agenda around quantum, we understand what's happening in not just the government-owned labs like DSTL, but what's happening in UKRI, what's happening in departmental programs that may be happening in several bits of government, and that we're able to make sure that's all joined up and coherent. And back to the point about being strategic. On the other point about how other governments organise, it's a really interesting one. You can imagine one of the things I've been doing in my first few months is meeting many of my international counterparts. And that sense of relief when you meet someone who has the same brief as you do, and you can sort of talk directly. But there's all sorts of different setups around the world. And I think it's really important to say that, you know, while I've obviously made some arguments today about why there are real advantages to having a science and technology department, I think the truth is, in any organizational question, right, that you create sort of pros and cons. You strengthen some linkages and you weaken other linkages. So I don't think there's one right answer at that level. But what is perhaps more true is that some of the things about investing in the capability of your civil service or your government staff, who might not always be civil servants in quite the sense that we have it, in investing in your partnerships and relationships with the external world, both academic and business. I do think those are the sort of strengths that are almost applicable in any institutional setup, and making sure we're watching others for how they're doing them well really matters.
Further descent into the thickets of Whitehall departmentalism. I'm David Walker, I chair Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust. We host the Mental Health Mission, which is a multi-million-pound programme answerable to the Office for Life Sciences to some extent, but to the National Institute of Health and Care Research, organised by your colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care. Meanwhile, the Medical Research Council and some of the other research councils have a multi-million-pound mental health research program. Now, pluralism is good, but to researchers on the ground, that could seem, does seem like a bit of a mess. So
I think this goes exactly to the point. I agree. I don't know that specific case well enough to kind of say, oh, yes, we should fix that. I don't know. But what we should at least have is an understanding of where that's happening and have kind of looked at the problem and consciously decided that we've got the right join up. I don't think we have kind of had all of the conversations that we need in order to be able to sort of roll out the fix. But I do think we're making good progress on thinking through what those issues are, getting the picture, even gathering the data to really understand spend right across the system is actually quite a complex activity, because there's lots of, I mean, if you sort of want to go like now, and even another level of nerdery, there's lots of different ways of cutting your R&D picture. You've got R&D by kind of sector, is it healthcare, is it energy? You've got R&D by kind of the fundamental technologies that are being used, AI being a great example. Well, that applies in all of those different areas. You've got cutting your R&D spend by geography. That's a really important dimension from a political perspective as well. And trying to understand what that system of spend looks like is something that I don't think government is good enough at today, and is a capability that we're going to have to build. And I mean, the two conversations that are most important as part of that, just from sheer numbers, are MOD and DHSC.
Thanks, John. Joe, I work for the Home Office in the National Security Community part of the Home Office. So I'm unusual as a civil servant. So I joined from a large tech company mid-career, and then I worked in the economic policy community, and now I've moved into the national security community. So from a position of some understanding of how those communities tend to work or not work together, I firstly wanted to say thank you. I was really relieved to hear you kind of name that as a challenge that we have to confront, particularly as we head into dealing with the challenges of emerging technologies like AI, but as you have pointed out, there will be others as well. I just wanted to kind of add to what you said, because I thought what you were broadly describing was what we sometimes call inside the Homeland Security Group sort of system leadership, and we sort of took those lessons from the counter-terrorism community, where actually there are loads of different parts of government that are involved in countering the threat from terrorists. And it's there's sort of an art to making sure that everybody is convened and doing the same thing for the same reasons at the same time in the most helpful way. But one of the lessons that we have drawn from that is the importance of accountability. And I thought maybe that I didn't hear that in your description of how you thought you might bridge the very unhelpful dichotomy that I think people create between prosperity and security, which I think is a false dichotomy. And particularly, I'm wondering about like political accountability, because I have found in my civil service career that things do tend to happen faster if you do have a cabinet minister at the end of it who feels super on the hook, but also feels as though they have the levers to do what they need to do. And I can't quite see how that accountability lines up yet within kind of, economic policy and national security challenges around emerging technology.
I think it's a really great question, and I'm going to sort of answer a question that isn't your question, but a closely related one as a way of managing what's a challenging point. I was just going to say, I think your point around political accountability is really critical, and whenever we look at any of these system leadership issues, to use your phrase, any of these kind of cross-cutting areas where we need to bring together lots of different pieces of the puzzle, it's undoubtedly the case that having a minister who is driving that forward really, really makes a difference. And it's most effective if that minister is the Prime Minister. That's, people ask, how do you really get things done in government? That works pretty well. And by the way, I think is a huge asset for DSIT right now. So yes, we have to take ministers along with us as we start thinking about systems leadership. It's actually quite difficult because we have a structure of ministerial accountability for different things. So it sounds very straightforward to say, you should sort this out and have a minister who's really driving it forward. That's not how we're kind of constitutionally set up, right? Ministerial departments have accountability that goes up to a Secretary of State. And in some ways, I think that's one of the reasons why interagency cooperation is often actually, whisper it soft, more effective than interdepartmental cooperation, because the dimension of serving your own minister does not create a naturally collaborative environment across departments. And we have to therefore almost kind of load in more on culture, relationships, ownership, process, systems, in order to try and get over what is just an inherently and deliberately a siloed setup in government, right? That is how our system of government works. That's not a political choice by any particular party. It's how we operate. So I don't think I've got the answer. I guess the best thing I can say is we have to work harder to fight against that. And I also think that ultimately that's what the Prime Minister of the day is asking of us.
Okay, a last question here. Yep. I'm sorry for those who've got their hands up, but we will be having a drink afterwards, so you'll get your chance then. Please.
Susanna from Civil Service World. You mentioned that we need to have science and tech in all the policy muscle across government, and I wonder what role you see for DSIT in helping to get that into policy muscle in other departments, but also, if I may, John, sorry, regulatory muscle. Any kind of quick reflections on how we can improve the chances of having good regulation or fit regulation, support regulators, however you want to phrase it, to meet the kind of oncoming challenges and opportunities that you've outlined?
Another two great questions. So first of all, on kind of how do you hardwire this thinking and capability right across government, I think the work of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor is worth just kind of planting into your thoughts at this point. Actually, the progress that's been made over the last few years in scientific expertise in government, as I said, I don't think it's a done journey, but I think we really have moved forward, and there is a serious, integrated network of chief scientific advisors across government working on exactly the challenge that you're talking about. But what I would add to that is this point about technical talent, and it's partly about kind of how far along that kind of research development funnel do you operate and where's your understanding, but it's also about background and the challenges in getting talent and experience and expertise, in particular from private sector technical talent, not just academic technical talent. Both are really important, and we need to marry them together more. On regulation, I think regulator capability is, on the one hand, a really big strength of the UK system, because actually the fact that we have regulators who are able to move at pace, and Sarah Healy talked about this in her last lecture, actually, the way that a regulatory system of independent regulators can help you with agility and pace. It doesn't make sense to kind of try and define all of the things all of the time through direct legislation. That's not an agile system. But because of the pace of change, and AI is sort of the canonical example of this, the demand that we're putting on regulators to build their own capabilities and to attract talent exactly in the competitive market that we've just been talking about tonight, that's a really serious effort, and we should kind of look that in the face. It has to be made to work, and that's going to have serious implications for where all our regulators are putting their energy and effort.
Okay, I think that brings us to an end. May I please invite Professor Linda McKee, Executive Dean for the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Well, Sarah, thank you very much for the last hour. It's a privilege for us to have you here tonight. DSIT is a mere 6 months old. And so we're starting out on a journey together with many colleagues in the audience as well. And this evening, you've taken us through a range of issues on science, innovation, and technology. You started out with pace, and let's face it, artificial intelligence is everywhere and all at once. But you then moved on to talk about the integration of technologies, and I find that very interesting. Sometimes we're driven by the media and what is of the moment, but that integration of technology and drawing upon history and moving into the future, I thought was a fascinating point that you raised, because the breakthroughs, your third point, many of us in university see ourselves at the forefront of those breakthroughs, but we wouldn't be able to make those breakthroughs without the history, the philosophy, all of the arts and humanities, but also within the science and technology, the vast centuries of knowledge that we've amassed. Now, you then moved on to pull us through hardware. And I saw on the invitation list that there are colleagues here tonight from Amazon. Okay, I struggle with Amazon Fresh. Please see me afterwards. Because like everywhere, that hardware, it's a killer. And you want to keep up with your kids, you know, and you want to feel you're out there. Yes, very good point. And then impact. Well, at universities, we're very much driven by the research excellence framework and our definition of impact. And you brought very keenly to my attention, and I'm sure other colleagues in the room too, how definitions can differ. And when I think of how Innovate UK uses impact, and you're very much talking about that the everyday, and we're trying to develop histories, just across a decade, of how our research has moved forward incrementally. And I think we could learn a lot from each other on that, because all our impact case studies are out there where public money, public good, and intellect has made that impact. Now, you then went on to give me lots of hints and tips for how I could run a faculty, how I could run a project. And I'm so proud to have you here and for you to be part of the civil service. And I think we could learn from the strategic, the trade-off of choices, the agility, and the expertise, and how to bring them all together. I loved the idea of the bridge, the arch, rather than the pillars, because those pillars, it always used to kill me, because I thought, well, the Acropolis has lasted, but, you know, it's still looking a bit fragile, and now we've got the weather getting at it as well. And then you moved on to talk about the economic and the security, the opportunity and risk. And that really brought it home to me, because there's a number of us who are leaving here this evening to join a Zoom call with colleagues in the Australian University of New South Wales, Arizona State University, and King's on the AUKUS agreement. And that brings together a range of academic disciplines: war and security studies, social sciences, business studies, and it brings together the commercial, because what is AUKUS all about? But it's also about the political, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific at the moment. And that, I think, resonates to some of the questions that we've heard tonight. So we're back to being agile, but I love the end point: stability and being consistent. To walk while chewing the gum. I think I'm always going to remember that. I've got a thing about chewing gum, you know. But I always have to say, love different flavors. And I think that idea of being stable, yet you're chewing on something, you're thinking about something new. Yeah, you really captured something tonight, and I think it's been a real privilege for us to share this evening with you. Now, I'm going to close by saying I'd also like to thank my colleague Marion Thane for introducing the Institute of Digital Futures. I know that you'll be connecting, and hopefully we will have that Centre for Digital Policy. The Strand Group. A bit of an apple in my eye, I have to say, because you've been out at the forefront there, and you have pushed at boundaries, and I think that's wonderful. And the Policy Institute, which has been a wonderful home to nurturing it. Now, you brought, all of you, Sarah along this evening. And Sarah, I feel really proud to be working with you. And I think on behalf of everybody in the room, I'd like to say a very big vote of thanks, much appreciation, Sarah, and you've really earned that drink. Thank you.